righty, well, I think we can get started now. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this diversity and inclusion webinar discussion today. We are so happy to have attendees from Australia and South Africa, as well as in the States. Hello, my name is Blake. I am a doctoral student at Claremont Graduate University, studying program evaluation, and I received my master's in organizational psych from Claremont as well.
And hello, everyone. My name is Sevelin Van Ronk, and I am also a doctoral student at Claremont Graduate University, studying positive organizational psychology. And I've been working as a consultant for almost 3 years now.
And thank you all so much for attending today, and welcome to our second discussion in our Making IO Visible series presented by My Mommy is an Organizational Psychologist. This is a book that Sevelin is the author of and I am the illustrator of. The idea behind this webinar series is to provide an opportunity for IO psychologists to come together to engage in meaningful discussions on key topics in our field and basically to promote the field. Today we'll be discussing diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and we have such a fantastic panel for you all. Given our limited time together, I'm going to really condense their bios and introductions and probably not do them justice in the process, but I'm really pumped for this panel. First, we have Preston Lindsay. Preston is a professor of IO psychology and the president, founder, and CEO of the Lindsay Group. This is an industrial organizational development firm he founded that offers sustainability services to nonprofits, startups, and small businesses. His research and practice areas include disrupting systemic and structural racism at the organizational level and the phenomenological impact of how trauma at work impacts workers' consciousness. Next, we have Graciela Meibar. Graciela has over 30 years corporate experience and is the founder and principal at Graciela Meibar Coaching, Consulting, Inspirations Incorporated. Her current work includes consulting, coaching, and mentoring with corporations and leadership around diversity and inclusion, commercial team development, and leadership development. And also joining us is Dr. Alecia Santuzzi. Dr. Santuzzi is an associate professor at Northern Illinois University, whose research includes disability and ableism in the workplace and how employees make decisions about disclosing stigmatizing information at work. In particular, her research focuses on the lived experience of workers. So thank you all of our panelists for agreeing to join us today and take part in this discussion. I'd also like to give a couple other huge shout outs. First is to Dr. Juliet Aiken. She was instrumental in helping us bring this panel together. So thank you so much for your helps there. And I would also like to thank Amelia Doe and Amrita Kaur. These are two members of our team that do the majority of the heavy lifting to get this these series together for you all. So thank you to you too. So a little background on this idea of visibility in IO and what inspired this larger series of talks. In short, you know, IO is not a very well understood discipline. Very few members of the public know that we exist, let alone what we do and how that can benefit the workplace. To help deal with this, Sevelin and I created the children's book called My Mommy is an Organizational Psychologist, which tries to depict the work that IOs do in a manner that even children can understand. So if you're interested in this gorgeously illustrated and highly informative book that can help you explain the work that you do to your friends and family, you can head over to mymommyisanorganizationalpsychologist.com and check out the physical and electronic versions of this book. All right, shameless self-promotion out of the way. For those of you who are attending who may not be aware of what IO psychology is, here's the definition provided by the American Psychological Association. A few key things about this definition are: 1, that we are a science; 2, that we study human behavior; and 3, that we can apply the knowledge we gain from these studies to improve the workplace. And since we are scientists, right, since we collect and analyze data, test hypotheses, and we have a nuanced understanding of human behavior at the individual and group level, in the realm of diversity and inclusion, this makes us incredibly valuable. For example, we are in a unique position to help develop equitable talent acquisition and promotion criteria. We can help leadership understand and lead diversity and inclusion efforts. We can help organizations manage resistance to diversity and inclusion efforts. And as our speakers will discuss, so much more.
So now you've heard us use the terms diversity and inclusion a couple times, and I just want to pause and briefly explain what that means and a key difference. One way I like to think about it is diversity is all about having a seat at the table. And whereas we can think about inclusion as having a voice at the table. So when we talk about diversity, we often are referring to these characteristics or traits that make us unique. And when we talk about inclusion, we usually mean these behaviors or social norms at work that help make people feel welcomed in the workplace. In a few moments, you'll hear our panelists talk about some D&I initiatives. This topic of diversity and inclusion is certainly really important, and we see it all over the place. So we see articles posted in Harvard Business Review, scholarly articles. We see things on the news. We see companies posting articles about how they care and work on D&I in their workplace. So I'm really thankful for all of you attending today's session. And now we are going to be joining our panelists in a moment.
And just, I wanted to sort of address an elephant in the room and provide a little context for some of this discussion today. In the last few days, our government has decided that, or key members in our government have decided that international students who are attending universities who have a completely online program will not be allowed to continue to stay in the United States. This is a decision that will impact tens of thousands of our friends and colleagues in a financial, a physical, and an educational manner. So there's a little context there. If you want to do something about it, what you can do is you can contact your representatives, or you can contact your university directly, pick up the phone and give them a call and say, hey, this is unfair, this is dangerous. What can we do to support our international friends?
Thank you, Blake. And also thank you to all the panelists who submitted questions when you registered for this event. So we've taken some of those questions and we will pose them to our panelists. And we've also created a diversity and inclusion prompt that we will pose to the panelists. So let's get started. The first question I have for the panelists are, what are some examples of discrimination people with physical and or mental disabilities face at work? How does this negatively impact those workers? And what can companies do to help make them feel more included?
I can start this one. This is one of the major areas of research that I've been working on, is the experience of disability. Oh gosh, we can start nationally. We have statistics that suggest that workers with disabilities are more likely unemployed, in fact, twice as likely to be unemployed relative to workers without disabilities. We know the labor force participation rates are way different for workers with disabilities, more like 22% for workers with disabilities compared to 69, 70% for workers without disabilities. Workers are more likely to be underemployed if they have disabilities, which means they're taking on jobs where they have skill sets that could actually exceed those jobs, so taking jobs that are of lower skill sets. And then wages. Compensation tends to be a lot lower for workers with disabilities compared to those without. And that's all at the national level. And unfortunately, that's been a trend for a very long time, even with major legislation like the ADA passing, really didn't change that trend, which is really unfortunate. So we have started to look more at a local level, look interpersonally to see where these discrimination experiences are occurring. So we start thinking about, what is it that these workers are experiencing when they're applying for jobs, when they're interviewing? What's happening day to day if they are hired? And things we're seeing there are, broadly speaking, workers are generally avoided by their coworkers and supervisors. So if people can get out of communication with them, they will. That can translate into, just social distance and physical distance, but it can also leak into personnel decisions. So workers are less likely selected for jobs, less likely promoted. In some laboratory research, we find that they're less likely to be brought on your team if you have the power to select members for your own personal work team. So those are all kind of factors that probably contribute to what we're seeing at a national level. One of the interesting forms of discrimination that I've observed, and this might be especially true with physical disabilities, is assumptive help. This is a term used when coworkers or supervisors give what's like unsolicited or help that they didn't ask for. On the surface, we look at that and say, oh, that's nice, right? And people are just being nice to each other. But remember, this is a performance domain in the workplace, and this also translates into education as well. It's also a performance domain. When you give unsolicited help to someone, that signals to them that they can't do it on their own. And that can be particularly damaging to a worker's confidence, which can translate into self-fulfilling prophecies and affect their performance down the road. So that is something that's not often discussed when we talk about discrimination, but certainly something that comes through, particularly with physical disabilities. The thought is that that's coming from a place of pity. So you feel sorry for a person, and if any of you have experienced that kind of reaction from somebody, it comes across initially as positive regard, but it can be damaging down the road because that conveys that you are in need of help and you are a target that needs that sympathy. So again, in a performance domain, that can be pretty damaging. Broadly speaking, stereotypes against workers with disabilities suggest that they're lower in competence, which again is something that will be damaging in performance-related domains like education and the workplace. We've been talking broadly about disabilities, and I think the question was posed broadly about disabilities, but over the last several years, we have been thinking about the stigma, the reaction that workers face, as well as the discrimination experiences a little bit differently depending on the type of disability. So a lot of the past work, past research associated with disability experiences are driven by what we know about people with visible physical disabilities. More recently, we come to understand that other types of disabilities like mental illness or psychological disorders have a different experience. There may be some elements like physical disability, like the reaction of pity, for instance, that can come through. But there is a much stronger negative stigma associated with mental illnesses that you don't always see with physical, especially visible physical disabilities. So with mental illness, you might see reactions of like a perceived threat. People are afraid of people with mental illness because they might be unpredictable or they might be concerned that they're dangerous. So that fear reaction might translate into different types of discriminatory behavior as well. In the last couple of years, the work I've been doing has also been kind of partitioning off cognitive and developmental disabilities. We put them under a category of neurodiversity. Again, some shared elements with physical disabilities and even mental illness, but there might be some uniquenesses associated with cognitive disabilities as well, or neurodiverse conditions. You could take learning disabilities, for instance. Neurodiverse conditions might include ADHD, learning disabilities, autism or ASD, and other cognitive and developmental conditions. Students with learning disabilities or workers with learning disabilities, when they disclose those disabilities at work or at school, they're often facing concerns about legitimacy. So people are worried that they're making false claims. That's usually because it's connected to things like accommodations, and they're worried that they're trying to game the system to get ahead, right? So workers are getting extra accommodations so they can have a competitive advantage over their coworkers, and the same thing in a school setting. So that perceived illegitimacy is part of the stigma that you might see, especially among those who are from neurodiverse groups as well. So yeah, so that's kind of what I see as a landscape in terms of discrimination experiences, national and interpersonally. What can we do about those things? I could probably cluster those into two categories. One, stay informed, and that's kind of an obvious one. So I'll give some examples about what we can stay informed about. there's a lot of variability in the term disability and ability differences. Even individuals who have, say, the same medical diagnosis, they're going to wear disability differently. It can depend on a lot of factors. How much social support they have at home, for instance, could change the extent to which they're experiencing limitation and the nature of their experience in the workplace. And so staying informed about the variability, I think, is particularly important. I would also be aware of the fact that over 80% of disabilities are concealable or completely invisible. And that's something that a lot of people either don't know or they forget about. Most of the time when people mention the term disability, they're thinking of the symbol with the wheelchair. That's a very small proportion of qualifying disabilities under the ADA. So with over 80% of disabilities being concealable in the workplace, you don't know who has disabilities and who doesn't most of the time. And that creates its own measurement issues in organizations. But it's also important to note that those individuals, they might not be experiencing discrimination directly because they're not telling you about the disability, or you don't know about the disability, but they may have a burden of anticipated stigma, anticipated discrimination. And so even though they're not out, so to speak, and telling you about their learning disability, they have that psychological burden. They know that they have something, and that anticipation can also be damaging to well-being as well as performance. So being aware of those issues among your workforce, I think, could be really important. The other category I'll briefly mention before I let some others jump in, being able to signal inclusion, I think, is important for organizations and practitioners. Often, disability is not included in diversity definitions, and that's true with organizational policies, and it's true in research even. So a lot of the work we see on diversity excludes disability entirely. So making a simple step toward including disability and ability differences in diversity statements is one big thing that can change and be more consistent across organizations. Beyond that, that's what's happening at the organizational level. Think about these interpersonal issues. These interpersonal issues could potentially be buffered by affecting the dynamics at the lower level in the organization. So think about ally programs and training. Think about making sure there's equal access to mentoring opportunities to make sure people have established social networks. I think later on we might be talking about, I'll bring it up now, employee resource groups. I think those could work. I think there's some recent research and practices that would suggest that if you can build those groups around the key work functions that need to be improved, rather than, say, creating a group for autistic workers, you're creating a group around some key functions that everybody can participate in, but knowing that those functions may be particularly challenging to certain types of disabilities. The last thing that I want to mention before I hand it over is making sure that we follow through and determine that inclusive practices are actually leading to inclusion. We have lists offered by the US Department of Labor of types of practices that organizations are engaging in that are called, quote, inclusive. But oftentimes the evaluation process stops there. Like once we can check off that we have these 3 inclusive practices, ta-da, we're an inclusive organization now. I think there needs to be more follow through to ensure that the impact that is intended actually is coming through. And I think many people will be surprised when their so-called inclusive practices are not actually translating to a felt experience within the employees. And so I offer that as something to think about for the practitioners in the room.
I'd like to build on some of the things that Alecia mentioned. First of all, making a statement about disability or ability within your diversity and inclusion statement for any corporation. In my former employer, I came up with a definition that basically addressed that, and it was, it said, every race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, ability, physical ability, and personality type. One team working together within an equitable, supportive, and respectful environment. So making that statement recognize all the different aspects of diversity, all the dimensions that diversity brings. As to what companies can do besides declaring a powerful statement is listen to your employees. Create a focus groups with those that are willing and open to discussions about this. At that company, I had a very dear friend who had a physical disability, and she was one of the most talented people I knew. She spoke 7 languages fluently and was in charge of our translation group that translated all documents for the company. And I reached out to her when I took on the role of D&I leader and said, I want to learn about what it's like for you at work. And I would love if you have other employees that are willing to talk to me. I really want to listen so that I can understand what it's like. And that led to a lot of innovation, especially around accessibility, things that we don't even think about. But all of a sudden, this group was pointing out to me the challenges that they face. And that led to a lot of innovation and creativity and solutions for them.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Alecia and Graciela. Preston, have you noticed anything similar to having initiatives in the workplace, but perhaps keeping coworkers and leaders accountable is a problem?
Repeat that question.
Sure. I was curious to know about initiatives in the workplace and if you had any ideas on how coworkers could keep each other accountable and how we can actually keep leadership accountable for these initiatives.
Yes. So the reality is that many of our white brothers, especially roles who deem themselves progressive, don't always value diversity and inclusion, but manage to do enough. They do. So naturally, organizations are guilty of the same offense. So I think that what's important is that people who have awareness of this reality, that they call it out, demand change, define that need for change. Because I mean, at a personal level, I personally hold everyone accountable, including the self, as we're all affected by white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And I think that, you know, we don't necessarily need the support of strong and consistent literature that attests to the persistence and prevalence of racism or racial justice or racial discrimination or discrimination in America, especially with respect to racial discrimination, because you know, what we do know is that Black women, men, boys, seemingly every day. And so organizations have to be committed to becoming, I think, more multicultural by adopting if they're wanting to really address the issues that we're seeing every day, that they see in organizations at a systems level especially. So that's how I would respond to that question.
Thank you. Another question posed by a few people actually were about HR and talent acquisition. And is it even possible to hire a diverse workforce if the area you're working in, like a city or county, is not very diverse?
If I may. So as a Black organizational psychologist, it's important that I make it a point to always say that I think it's important that organizations remain committed to an anti-racist vision. If they're wanting to recruit and retain people of color, Organizational policies must set forth goals and strategies specific to creating a more multiple anti-racist organizational environment. And this is achieved by doing the work of reflected in every institution and organization in the US especially. And that organizational policies have been completely privilege and racial oppression since this country's inception. And policies must race if you're wanting to recruit and then retain Black and Brown and other people of color. Greater diversity in the workplace can no longer be just a compliance-related goal. Organizations have to confront unconscious bias that we all know interfere with recruitment decisions and beyond that. And I would also emphasize this point by saying that the issue is not just specific to the recruitment of Black and Indigenous people of color, but it's about retaining this talent. And so we would do well as organizational practitioners, organizational leaders, to be asking those questions, and not even just anyone that's an organizational scholar or a practitioner or an organizational leader, but any person that is consciously aware of this harm that we know to happen in organizations, that we are asking the tough questions, right? Like the questions that we all know make people uncomfortable, white people namely, white people in leadership who wield position and power. If they understand how their organization is harming Black, Indigenous, and people of color, how systems and structures of their organization intentionally excludes people of color, and is the organizational environment conducive for the outcome of recruiting and then retaining this group, this diverse group. So this, for me, is about dismantling racism, dismantling systems and structures that have continued to perpetuate white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and continue through that vein harming people of color. And so organizations have to endeavor to become committed to doing the work of dismantling racial oppression internally by conducting analysis across systems, which would uncover how racism and oppression are operationalized within. And from that analysis should emerge a tactical plan for becoming an organization that integrates an anti-racist commitment into its programming. So white people sharing power with people of color, white people in leadership taking leadership from, sharing power and taking leadership from and being counted Indigenous and people of color, white people being comfortable with being uncomfortable while on the journey to becoming anti-racist at an individual level, with appropriate resources, the trainings and encouraging discussions on race in an effort to transform cultures. Of course, remaining committed to that, that vision of becoming more anti-racist and multicultural. So it goes beyond, recruitment for me. What we know is that this is something that is systemic. It needs across organizational systems.
I'd like to build on what Preston mentioned, which I totally agree with. But I'm going to give you an example of what I thought was a very pragmatic solution to an issue that I discovered. After taking the role of the D&I lead, I get an invitation from the head of recruiting, the director of recruiting. They wanted me to attend the National Black MBA conference, where we did a lot. This company recruited a lot of MBAs for interns for finance and marketing. And so I went to the National Black MBA conference. Then I went to NASHIMBA, the Hispanic MBA conference. I learned a lot. I come back to the office. I had a meeting with them And I said, tell me, besides these two conferences, what are we doing in terms of recruitment? So they told me, this is a Southern California company. They tell me, well, we go to UCLA, we go to USC, and we go to Northwestern, and we go to Vanderbilt. And I'm like, and those are the only universities we go to? And they said, pretty much for MBAs. And I said, so year after year, we're recruiting folks from these universities. So we're basically getting the same thought leadership because they're being taught by professors in these universities. And so we're recruiting more of the same. So my biggest challenge was immediately, I said, no, I need you to spread the universities that you're going to start recruiting from. Because we want, besides all the factors that, yes, we need more minorities represented in our MBA interns and hires, we also need different thought leadership with different thinking and different training to make our MBA class the best that it can be. So that, to be honest with you, they had never thought about it. But here's the outsider coming in and looking at all this and saying, this doesn't make sense. Sorry, guys, we're going to have to change this policy. And we did. And all of a sudden, we had an influx of different thoughts coming into the company.
And Sister Graciela, I think that that is certainly serving as an effective example of how we can recruit more diverse groups for the workplace. But I think that for me, in my mind, that this goes, this goes beyond the issue of recruitment, because right, we're talking about, we bring them in, okay? I could create a pipeline program that, and through a strategic alliance or partnership with HBCUs, because we know there's talent there. We know that they're capable, they're getting the education, right? But what happens when they come in, right? For me, it goes beyond diversity optics, right? And for me, and I'm not suggesting that that was your argument, but what I'm saying is that I know all of those organizations out there who will go that far. And for me, what I'm saying, and what I've always been, what I have been saying for supporting organizations with becoming more multicultural and more anti-racist in nature, is that that is never enough. So the question goes that we are conditioning the environment of the organization to ensure that we are able to not just make it a space where Black and brown people, but they are safe.
And I totally agree with you, Preston, because, but I thought, let me bring him in, and then I going to lead initiatives that are also, if they want to stay and they found that this is the company they want to work on, I'm going to work very hard on number 2, on retention. But it was almost like, which one do I do first? So I decided, let me bring him in, and then let's work on retention, because I do agree with you that you have to have both.
And I'm with the organization that is not multicultural and isn't endeavoring, that hasn't adopted an anti-racist vision, that they maybe need to hold off.
Yeah, there are companies that need that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'll just jump in for a second here, because I'm thinking of, thinking mainly of disability, but what I'm seeing through the US Department of Labor reports, when organizations are listing out inclusive practices, again, specific to disability, probably the top 3-5 reasons that they are trying to recruit and retain workers with disabilities has to do with corporate image, more so than actually changing, what Graciela was talking about, like the diversity of thought contributing to organizational decisions and things like that. So I think it kind of unites what the two of you are saying. If they're going to stop with just having a positive image, they're not going to follow through to actually see the value and the benefit of full integration.
And Sister Alecia, but you're right on point with that. What I would say is that this practice, this anti-racist organization development practice, goes to has an anti-oppressive lens also. So this goes beyond racial, oppression that we know to exist in the organizational context. Thank you for calling that out, because that is certainly something that is, I think, need to as named again, that this goes to the issue of race and all the other forms of oppression that we know to exist in organizations.
Absolutely.
It seems like a common theme amongst all of you is saying that organizations might put up a front otherwise, so they might be saying one thing but doing another. And I know we said we might be able to have time for questions at the end, but someone did send me a question. I think it's really relevant to what you're saying, so I think I will just read this one out. South Africa has quite a progressive constitution on equality in terms of gender, disability, race, in comparison to the states in the UK. But while the policies are available, it's the detail that is quite concerning. For example, when addressing trans issues, gendered restrooms, pronoun assumptions, even gendered team exercises, are practitioners aware of this structural discrimination?
I think in the US, to some degree, they are. I'm not saying that everybody is, but I think that there are resources in the US that help companies that are more progressive and they are more willing to invest in really creating that inclusive culture. There are a lot of resources to ensure that you are really, and with a lot of detail in the US. So I think that in that regard, I don't know the details of South Africa, unfortunately, but I would say that at least in the US, for those companies that wanna be seen as leaders around all areas of diversity, there are resources that we can rely on.
Do any of you three panelists have an example of a resource that someone could pull from? What can coworkers, leaders do about this?
Okay, I would refer you to the Human Rights Campaign, HRC. HRC is an organization that is all about bringing equality and benchmarks to companies that want to compare themselves to the best. And it gives, they publish a score, a list with a score each year for the companies that reach 100 points. 100 points means that you're checking and that your company is doing all the things that are in their eyes required. And they are the eyes, they are the authority right now, in my opinion, to ensure that your policies and your benefits, your practices are inclusive to all, including members of the LGBTQ community.
Sevelin, would you repeat the question?
Sure, Preston, thank you for asking. My question is, what can people do about it? Let's say I see discrimination in the workplace and I want to bring it up to leaders. I want to do something about it. What specific tactics or resources can I use?
So, first of all, disadvantaged groups, Black and brown, Black, Indigenous, other people of color, experience multiple sources of oppression. So, triple oppression is a reality. There are multiple oppressive factors in isolation. People are confronted with many things. So you may think that you understand it, but sometimes there's more there than you know. So I think that for me, I always like to follow the Cotter model when I'm talking to people about resisting oppression within the context of organizations, because I think it's beautiful and it's interesting that a white man conceptualized this. But I think that first learning, first fully understanding what you know. Yep.
Can you state that model again? You cut out right as you named the model.
Oh, sure.
It's
It's an organization it's really an organizational change model. Initial steps, understand what you think that you know, challenge your assumptions, right? Take the time to get to understand the problem. And if there is a problem there and you feel that you understand it well, generate that urgency, then move to forming that coalition. And I think that and I'm talking about what people can do in an organization immediately, not connecting with an advocacy group that's external to the organization, which can be effective. But for me, I'm like, let the people own the initiative, the planning, the change process in a way that is very direct, right? So, and that has much to do with my personality. I tend to be very radical in my approaches in life. But I am about advocating that people form groups or coalitions and laying out a plan that helps them to communicate to people who are in positional power what the problem is in great detail, how the problem is harming, going to the experience of harming Black and Indigenous people of color and LGBTQ and other groups who we know that are oppressed in the context of of our society and in organizations, and establishing creative, I think, interventions for dealing with the problem. And I think that is an excellent first step. There's much work there, right? Getting connected with people and understanding if there are commonalities in your oppression. Honestly, like in my mind, there are levels to this, but I think that a group of people who represent multiple sources of oppression have the ability to more power than they know. And I think that if there's a space where, an opportunity where these individuals can come together and advocate for themselves in a direct way, that is a beautiful manifestation of their power. And so that would be my recommendation, is to form a coalition, establish that urgency, and demand change.
I'd like to mention one more resource that I remember. There's a tool called GDIB, the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmark. It's a tool that is available to basically measure your organization's journey on the diversity and inclusion spectrum. And it gives you many possible positions that you are from. Are you a best practice, or are you basically doing nothing? In multiple categories that basically affect an organization, or they are an integral part of an organization. It's a fabulous tool. It's free to use. It was developed by 100 D&I practitioners from around the world. And all you have to do is go to their website and ask permission to use it. I encourage people to look at it because it's fabulous.
And for those who are wanting, and I'm just resources, I have many. Here's one. It is a continuum on becoming a more anti-racist, anti-oppressive, more multicultural organization. And it is out of the Dismantling Racism resource book, which is one of the beginning initiatives of the anti-racist organization development movement, is what I call it. It is a way of classifying, categorizing systems of oppression, identifying them, giving them names. There are criteria. And I think that this is a great way for people to, an evidence-based approach to understanding problems systems of oppression within the organizational context. And I have these resources and I'm happy to share them out if folks want to shoot me an email. I don't know if there's going to be a slide with our contact info, but I'm happy to put it in a chat and share that out.
Yes, thank you for offering that. We will be posting a recording of this on our website, and we'll make sure to put the contact info of the 3 panelists there for you.
Great.
Thank you for sharing those resources. Alicia, is there anything you want to add about tips or resources, what you would recommend to someone who's wanting to create positive change?
I think just related to the question that you posed about voicing discrimination, whether it's on behalf of someone else because you observed it or yourself. I think one thing that people may want to prepare for is for the possibility of mixed motives counter arguments. That's something that I know from personal experience as well as research. People are very threatened when you suggest that they are showing bias or prejudice or discrimination, and they're going to be prepared to defend themselves, and they're going to find evidence to support it. So if someone is complaining that they received a negative performance evaluation because their membership in some social category, they're going to be prepared on the back end to find evidence to support that performance evaluation. And so kind of moving forward, being ready for it's not always going to be the case, but in the case where there's some defensiveness that occurs when you bring up even the idea that there's bias or discrimination in this organization, be prepared for that mixed motives conversation, because I think that is kind of a natural default in response to kind of that threat of being called out as biased.
I mean, it's certainly the case when a person of color calls out a white person for their racism, right? Or calling out systems of racism, or elements of racism that we identify in culture. We see that. So anyway, snaps to you for calling attention to that in the way that you do.
I know we're over time, but I feel like I have to ask this last question. What do we do when we're confronted with someone that is getting defensive?
As a coach and as a DI leader, I combine those 2 skill sets and try to meet them where they are without being, without calling them out that you need help. But my approach is, can we talk more about this? And can I share with you experiences that I've had? So to me, my approach is to, in a gentle way, sometimes, and more firm at the time, depending on the circumstance, educate them, develop their awareness. Because to be honest with you, sometimes they just looking at the world through their own set of eyes, and they're not looking beyond, and they think everyone sees the world through their eyes. And it's just about creating that change in them that opens their mind to accept different points of views and change. That's my approach with leaders.
Hi. Because I'm very tired of having held white people's hands through situations I should not necessarily need to do the work of getting you to see what the problem is. I'm a practitioner and an IO psychologist, and I'm committed to improving, helping organizations to improve in all the ways that I can. Remain committed, especially those leaders who I know who are dealing with delusion. And so for me, in that capacity, I make it a point, not always the case that the situation looks the same. Like everybody presents a little differently. The challenges are different across people. So for me, if I'm being totally honest, one requires a great deal of patience and understanding.
Yeah.
And a high level of, which sometimes I fail at. Just being totally open with you and real with you. And so it involves, when I'm successful, it involves those two elements which I spoke to, patience and understanding, and recognizing that there's, for, I think, an individual to decolonize and unlearn, but they have to be willing. If I discern that an individual is not willing to at least see a problem, to hear what I am, prototypical self, that their own lens, their own consciousness, if they are able to come out of the, go beyond their ego and look at things and consider my perspective in that vein, then I'm willing to support the individual with becoming in their journey to become more anti-racist, right? But I think that if it's an instance where personally I'm encountering a leader who just isn't willing to do the work, then I'm not going to do the work either. It doesn't work, and I end up suffering, right? And so just as a Black organizational practitioner who is anti-racist in orientation, I'll do the work. I'll support people who are willing to do the work, and for those who are not willing to do the work, I'm not interested in partnering with those individuals. Me and what I am committed to, because what I won't ever do is be complicit in my oppression. I've done that for too long. So.
Thank you for sharing your approach to that, and it has to be effort on both sides. At this time, I think I'll let the panelists, if you have any closing comments, right now is your opportunity to have a closing comment.
Anti-racist organization development and anti-racist organizational change are a thing. I think every organizational science practitioner, the organizational leader, whoever you are in the world, especially if you're a key decision maker, go get educated in that way. Certainly be committed to adopting a personal anti-racist vision for the self, before really committing yourself to doing the work of trying to transform an organization. I would say introduce yourself to the work of those who have come, who were doing the work of developing this particular specialization of organization change of D, because I think that it would be useful to you. It is in language that I think that the layperson can understand. Mm-hmm. So there are incredible tools for evidence-based tools for classifying and for facilitating change. So there are no excuses at this point.
Thank you, Preston. Graciela or Alecia, any closing comments?
I'm going to leave you with my favorite quote. And the reason that I chose this, because the first time I read it, it really made me pause and reflect. And the quote says, "The greatest voyage of discovery would not be to travel to foreign lands, but to behold the universe through the eyes of another." Marcel Proust, French writer.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. We'll definitely have to repost that quote. Alecia, any closing comments from you?
Are you serious? You want me to follow that?
I know, good luck.
Alecia, you're brilliant.
I have no quotes for you. I'm going to go super boring, but deliberately so. We didn't have a chance to touch on this topic in particular, but For students in IO and others, I think it's really important to know your rights. Broadly speaking, know laws that are at the national level and others to protect you and to protect others. I personally find employment law really boring, but really important, especially when we're talking about civil rights issues. But perhaps more importantly than being able to recognize what's in legislation is to recognize what's not in legislation, where those pieces of legislation fall short. That becomes part of what an organization can pick up from. That's their springboard for figuring out how they can make use of what's left after national legislation has covered its ground to what an organization can do to better support diversity and inclusion. And there's a lot of ground to cover and a lot of control that organizations can have over that diversity and inclusion experience. Don't just assume that these national laws like the ADA and the Civil Rights Act are going to fix things for you. There's plenty of work to do at the organizational level, and organizations should feel accountable for that.
And, oh, I know we have to go, but she said, yes, I hear you, Sister Alicia, but the laws, the legislative process, the judiciary, the system has a small group of people in this country and continue to harm people who look like me. And so I think that there's incredible opportunities for organizations of color. And so I just wanted to add that piece because I don't ever feel like I can rely on the law to do right by me.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you for adding all of your closing comments, and round of applause to our three panelists for taking time out of their day to share their insights, expertise, and knowledge with us. As a closing comment, I would just like to say, please follow us on our social media pages, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, because soon we'll be reaching out to our followers and asking for feedback on topics for future webinars. This webinar recording will be posted on our website, so please go tell your friends, family, colleagues, anyone who wasn't able to be here to go watch this recording later. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
And again,
Bye-bye.
call your universities, make them uncomfortable, make them do whatever they can to protect our international friends. This is important.
Yes.
Yeah. Our international brothers and sisters, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.